just like reference couldn't be what gives our words their meanings and our uses of them and so on, neither can intentionality of speaker. Now let me try to use one of Derrida's famous examples. I draw up a grocery list for my wife. I write it down in sensible marks. These are the things we need: toilet paper, we need stuff for the kids, you know, all this candy, and then of course cash so that we can buy fast food for supper. It's a standard way of shopping. I leave the grocery list and I drive away and I'm killed utterly. I'm run over by a bus, flattened like a tortilla. My wife comes in, and can my message function in my radical absence? Yes. She can still go to the store, buy the kids food, and maybe only later will they notice, where's Dad? And then they hear on the news, you know, overweight philosopher flattened by truck, tortilla. Those signs can work in my radical absence. Now, can they work if I had no intentionality at all in writing them? Yes. Suppose I wrote them 3 months ago with the intention, or not, well, let me make it even a simpler example. Suppose I wrote them that afternoon with the intention of having my wife leave the house so I could call a lover. Would that make the list ineffective because my intention was misunderstood? No. Many philosophers have wanted to tie meaning to what the speaker and or language user intends. But words have their functions. They're, to use Derrida's phrase, they're disseminating meanings apart from those intentions. Now, let's don't caricature his claim. This does not mean that we cannot intend. We can, but it means we cannot fix meaning by our intentions. This is very important when we read a text by an author in philosophy, because we're frequently led to ask the question, what did he intend to say? And a deconstructive reading will lead us in the direction of not what did he intend to say, but what are these physical marks? How can I interpret these physical marks? To use that example, and that, by the way, is an anti-hermeneutic remark. It's a remark sort of against what might be called the idea that there could be the right interpretation. This is another important part of Derrida's take on language and language practices. The idea that there could be the right interpretation. In a way, there's no more powerful idea in the discipline of philosophy than the idea that there can be the right interpretation. After all, it's that idea that allows us to give our students B's and C's as opposed to the A's we would make if we had written the paper. It's what keeps us, it seems, continually reading Aristotle and so on in order to get them right. Finally, Derrida makes the outrageous claim that in the last analysis, there is no such thing as the right reading, the right interpretation. There is no interpretation that can bring interpretation to an end. Good books, really great texts, do not cut off interpretation. They lead to multiple interpretations. Great examples of this would be the Bible, which I think it's pretty obvious has not yet reached closure on interpretation. I mean, you know, I grew up in a community where there were Baptists, Methodists, Church of Christ. Took me a while to get into the city and meet Jewish people, Muslims, others. It became clear to me that reading the Old Testament was difficult to come up with the right interpretation. And what was wrong was the very idea that there could be the right interpretation. Now, the converse is the claim that people find outrageous, but it's not made by Derrida. That means since there's no the right way, then any way is as good as any other. Now, Derrida is not compelled to hold that view, and he doesn't. Not every way to speak and or read is as good as every other. And let me just put it simply. No one holds that view. Derrida, to the extent that he refuses to play a standard philosophical game, just will not play. The fact that there is no final book, you know, one last master encyclopedia containing all the wisdom of total coverage, final knowledge, the last book, none other ever needs to be written, Derrida considers that a reductio ad absurdum of the idea of perfect interpretation, the right interpretation. This does not at all mean that we don't, in loose, rough and ready ways, judge interpretations all the time. And this does not at all mean that, practically speaking, some interpretations are obviously slightly better than others. Let me return to familiar ones like the traffic light. If it's red and you see it as green, the outcome can be disastrous. Derrida doesn't deny it. You know? It's a bad misreading. Bad misreading. But this is a familiar mistake, and it's made about a lot of Derrida's work. Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this. That is a straw person argument. No one in the world believes it or ever has believed it. No one, Derrida or anyone else, believes that every view is as good as every other view. That's only a view we discuss in freshman philosophy class in order to quickly refute it. I mean, no one believes it. There are no defenders of the view. And since this tape will be going out, if we run into one, it will be interesting. But we will likely find that person in one of the institutions that Foucault discussed rather than in some seminar. Okay? I mean, that's where we'll find them, if anybody believes that. Now, Derrida's kind of slippage is to remind us that the text of philosophy is not fixed, cannot be fixed. It is of the nature of the text of philosophy and its relation to language that we cannot fix it once and for all. In a way, it's like the leaky ship where we haven't got anything to stop the leak, so we just keep bailing. I mean, the leak is in the language. One way to give you an analogy that may make it come alive and be simpler for you, and that's been hard for me to do with a philosopher who's very difficult like Derrida, is to think about it in the context of the way that Augustine attempted to develop a rhetoric about God. And then Augustine realized that it was already impious to use finite human marks and sounds to praise an infinite being entirely separate from those finite marks and sounds. So he was driven to silence. If one were to take that same picture of language without the thought of developing a rhetoric of God, but left just with the finite marks and sounds, and no inner teacher, Christ, the inner teacher, to tell us when our signs worked and when our words referred, then we would have a language that operates by disseminating meaning, by moving meaning, by shifting it. So if you were to have, for example, Derrida criticize Habermas, Habermas would say something like this. He would go, understanding is a condition for our linguistic practices. Derrida would respond, if that is so, then so is misunderstanding equally constitutive. Because understanding won't make sense conceptually unless misunderstanding does. They are correlatives. Does that make, well, I hope that makes sense. I mean, I'm asking a rhetorical question now about a philosopher who does rhetoric, but anyway, as well as argument. So these are the kind of things that irritate people.